So I'm going to take you through some of the findings of the thematic review. And these are the slides that I was saying have got quite a lot of details on them. I'm not going to go into every detail, but I thought it would be helpful to pull out what's in there. So we did the thematic review, myself and my colleagues, just over a year ago, about 14, 15 months ago. It was delayed in publishing because COVID hit literally as we finished the visits. I was out on a visit 2 days before we went into lockdown, the last visit of the inspection. However, over the autumn, we got in touch with some of the good practice examples and got updates on how they've been able to adapt their work with families during COVID. And so there are those practice examples out there. And one of them includes Karen Shore, that are going to be speaking in a wee while. So we went out and spoke to quite a good range of parents and carers, of staff, of partners, and children and young people, crucially. There's a couple of sketch notes that are included in the review, but are also wider. So I've included this one. I'm sure you've all seen it before. But again, for anyone newer to this really sets out the differences between the three. And this sketch note is one of the bases that we used to inform the review as we were planning it. So we asked two high-level questions. How are families engaged in family learning activities, and how are families benefiting from family learning activities? Probably very similar questions to those that you might ask yourselves for your own programmes. Series of questions underneath those, but those were the two core questions we really wanted to answer. So we found a range of strengths. We found that where schools and early learning centres have family learning in place, that's really helping to build positive relationships with parents. And in some cases, overturning views of parents of schooling based on their previous, perhaps negative experience when they were children. And actually, that's been really helpful in a whole range of ways in terms of successful family learning activities, but also in terms of parents really being involved with the school community. Family learning is starting to improve outcomes in terms of attainment and achievement in those areas that have got a strong family learning provision, really helping families to adapt and take on new skills. And I think some of those have probably been really important in the last year. Children and young people were able to talk about having increased confidence and self-esteem because of the parent engagement and family learning that they'd been involved in and that their parents had been involved in. And a few adults were gaining qualifications. I have to say that's probably the weakest area of the four, but there were a few examples where the parents themselves were actually gaining qualifications, going into volunteering, taking on jobs, in some cases taking on responsibility for delivering aspects of the family learning themselves. There were some areas of improvement, and this is probably the bits that's most helpful in terms of thinking through evaluation. There was still some confusion about key features of family learning and the difference between family learning and parental engagement. So all that still needs to be clear. And again, if you've got a partnership that's helping to deliver, it would be useful to spend some time and just make sure that everyone's on the same page around that. And again, to set up shared objectives and evaluate together as partners would be really helpful. The partners need to establish robust arrangements to enable them to report on the impacts. That'll be no surprise to anyone, I suspect, that actually that quite often there was really good practice going on, but people weren't able to capture that really well and therefore weren't really able to share it. Or in some cases, one partner had quite strong information but hadn't shared it. So again, setting that up from the very start will be helpful to you. There was an issue around the sustainability of family learning. Quite a lot of it had been developed on the back of fairly short-term funding. And so that's a sort of open question for local authorities and other providers about how you actually embed this into your provision more generally for the long term. And as I said before, there were some progression routes for adult learners, for the parents, for the carers, that could have really done with being strengthened, where adults would really have valued that. So, again, I presume most of you will already have seen this sketch note, but I wanted to include it just in case you hadn't. These are some of the features of high quality learning. family learning. And again, you might want to think through these in terms of when you're setting up your evaluations. So trusted relationships, we know, is at the core of that. How are you going to know whether you've built trusted relationships with your parents and your carers, and indeed with the children and young people taking part as well? That whole responsiveness to the needs of families. How are you identifying the needs of the families that you want to take part? How are you going to know if you've met the needs of those families? And they might not be the needs that you're identifying. They might come in with other ones that they really want help with. How inclusive is it? Again, how do you assess whether you're reaching the parents and carers you want to reach, whether there's any groups of parents or carers or indeed families that are being excluded, not intentionally, but because of maybe of the way it was set up? Thinking through the purpose of planning the progression routes and how you're going to develop the family learning on. Again, the earlier you can do that, I mean, you'll need to revisit it throughout, but if you can put that in place from the start, that will really help you. I apologise for my mobile going off. And achievement, again, recognition. We tend to find that people are getting better at recognising the change in children and in young people, not so good about the achievements of adults, but that can be really helpful and important to parents to hear actually what they're learning and supporting them to identify what they are learning. One of the places I would say to look, other than Karen Shores, to maybe look at Fourth View, primary school in Edinburgh, which again there's a sketch note of, and they've been very good at helping parents to identify their own journey as parents, but also just as adult learners. So that's another place you can look.